Part 1. The man who listened 2 stories in the desert. He arrived at the desert in the late afternoon. There was no crowd there. There was no city. Just dry wind, scattered stones, and a silence that seemed too ancient to be human. The man walked without haste, like someone who wasn't looking for a specific place, but for an answer he had never been able to name. He had heard of a preacher, a man who didn't speak like the others. They said he didn't teach like the synagogue masters. They said he told stories too simple to seem important. And yet, no one came away the same after hearing them. The man didn't know why it bothered him so much. But it was annoying. When he finally found the group, there was no stage, no altar, no structure. Just people sitting on the floor, as if time had stopped there. And in the center, a man. There was nothing about him that immediately caught my attention. Nothing grand about it. Nothing theatrical about it. But when he spoke, the air changed. The desert man approached and stood silently. And he listened. A man went out to sow. That's how it started. Simple story. Almost common. A farmer scattering seeds on different types of soil. Some fell along the way and disappeared. Others grew on rocks, where they couldn't take root. Others were suffocated among thorns. And some in good soil where they grew. The desert man frowned. That's all it seemed like. Story about agriculture. But no one there seemed to think that was all there was to it. The people around them weren't smiling. They didn't even comment. They were just listening. As if they were expecting something that hadn't been said yet. Later, another story began. A shepherd had 100 sheep. Her voice was calm, almost distant. But each word seemed to carry weight. The pastor notices something is wrong. A single sheep has gone missing. And then, something strange happens. He leaves the other 99 and sets off in search of the lost one. The desert man felt an immediate unease. No pastor would do that. No rational man would abandon the whole for a part. But in that story, he did. And nobody questioned it. Then another one came along. Woman. A coin lost inside one's own house. And she turns on a light and searches until she finds it. Another story that's too simple. Another image that's far too common. But there was something about them that wasn't simple. He was insistent. As if each story were pushing something into the mind of the listener. Without asking permission. The desert man began to notice something strange. These stories didn't end when they were told. They continued. Inside the head. Within the silence. Inside something he couldn't name. That same night, a different story was told. A son who abandons the home. Take your share of the inheritance. Some in the world. And when all is lost, he decides to return. The man was awaiting trial. Rejection. Distance. But the opposite is true. The father runs. Restore. As if the error hadn't erased the value. The desert man felt something uncomfortable in his chest. That didn't make sense within his logic. But it made sense within a different context. Something deeper. When night fell, he didn't leave. It was left. Sitting among strangers. Trying to understand why such simple stories were dismantling something inside him that he didn't know existed. And then he realized something even stranger. No one there was asking for an explanation. Nobody interrupted. No one demanded an immediate answer. As if they already knew that stories weren't meant to be resolved. Yes, they are loaded. Before going to sleep, he heard another one. A man entrusted resources to servants before traveling. When he returned, some had multiplied what they had received. Another one had hidden it. And the result was not neutral. It was revealing. Not about wealth. But regarding responsibility. The desert man began to feel discomfort again. Because it seemed less like a story. And another mirror. That night he didn't sleep. The wind passed through the stones. But inside it there was something that wouldn't stop. The stories continued to unfold without being told. As if they had already been planted. And now they just grew. Part 2. The man who began to see the invisible. The man couldn't say exactly when things started to change inside him. Perhaps it was in the first story. maybe on Monday. Or perhaps it was in that strange silence that followed each narrative, as if the whole world held its breath for a few seconds before existing again. But now, something about him was no longer the same. He had no answers. But he no longer had peace in the kind of ignorance he had lived in before. The next morning, he returned to the place where the man had been speaking. There was no different crowd. There was no new structure. Everything looked exactly the same. But he wasn't. He sat closer this time. Without knowing why. He just felt he needed to hear it again. The voice started as before. Simple. Almost common. A man prepared a banquet. The story described a big party. Invitations have been sent. Everything was ready. But one by one the guests began to refuse. One said he was busy. Another said he had business to do. The other simply ignored it. And then something unexpected happens. The host changes the focus. He calls others. People who weren't expected. People who were not in the initial plans. The desert man frowned. There was something there that deeply bothered him. It wasn't just a story about a party. It was about replacement. Regarding choices. Regarding who gets in and who gets left out. Then another one came along. A wounded man lies by the side of a road. Important people pass by. Respected. But none stop. Until someone who didn't belong to the expected group shows up. And that someone helps. To care. Get up. And then it disappears. Without recognition. Entitled. Without justification. The desert man sensed.
If you wish to deepen your knowledge of Jesus, the Gospels, and the Christian life, I have prepared a complete guide that can help you on your faith journey. In addition to the main guide, you'll receive 3 special bonuses today. The ebook, The Lost Parables, the Gospel Study Journal, and the guide, The Hebrew Mindset. If you found this content helpful, click the first link in the description to learn more. I hope this material helps you further understand Christ's message and strengthen your spiritual journey.
Something different this time. It wasn't just confusion. It was a confrontation. Because he noticed something uncomfortable. Kindness wasn't always where he expected it to be. The days passed. And he kept coming back. Not out of curiosity. But something inside him felt incomplete when he didn't hear those stories. It was as if the silence was now heavier than words. A new story has emerged. Field. Wheat growing. But also weeds sprouting up in the middle. The workers wanted to tear everything down immediately. Separate. Correct. Eliminate what was wrong. But the answer was not immediate. Let them grow together. The desert man felt discomfort again. He wanted order. Separation. Clarity. But the stories never revealed that so easily. They insisted on waiting. Time. In the process, another story emerged. Talents entrusted to different people. One buries what one has received. Another one multiplies. Another one takes a risk. And the result is not just a difference in effort. It's a difference in existence. The man began to notice something unsettling. In these stories, not acting was also an action. And hiding it wasn't neutrality. It was a choice. That night, he did not return to the camp. But not because I didn't want to. Because he couldn't. The stories now followed him even when he wasn't there. No wind. In silence. In the shadows of the stones. He began to notice something even stranger. The stories weren't just describing things. They were reorganizing the way he saw everything. A simple field now seemed like more than just a field. The road seemed like more than just a road. People seemed more than just people. It was as if everything had 2 layers now. Visible one. And another one hidden. On the 3rd day he returned again. And he heard another story. A son who returns after being lost. But this time he didn't just hear the response. He listened to his father's behavior. The movement. By press. The breaking of expectations. The hug before the explanation. Forgiveness before justification. And something inside him gave way a little. Not entirely. But it was enough for him to realize that his way of judging the world was not the only possible one. After that, he began to change the way he listened. Previously, he sought immediate meaning. Now he waited. He would let the story finish inside him before trying to understand it. And that's when something new happened. He began to realize that each story wasn't just about situations. I was talking about him. The sower spoke of how he received things in life. The sheep was talking about how he would get lost without realizing it. The coin spoke of what he allowed to pass within his own home. The sun spoke of what he rejected in himself. And the banquet spoke of the opportunities he was unaware of. But that wasn't comfortable. It was uncomfortable, because there was no longer any way to listen without being included. That night he was alone for a long time. The wind was stronger, the coldest stones, but something inside him was moving. He didn't know what it was called yet, but he knew he could no longer go back to where he started. And then he understood something for the first time. The stories weren't about characters. The characters were about him. Part 3. The man who could no longer be the same in the days that followed. The man realized something he could no longer ignore. It wasn't just the content of the stories. That was the effect they left. As if each narrative were a stone thrown into deep waters, and the ripples continued to spread long after the initial impact. He could no longer hear the world in the same way. Not even looking at people the same way. Not even thinking of oneself in the same way. He tried to return to his old life. The routine. Common conversations. Quick thoughts without depth. But there was something that broke that comeback. The stories kept coming back. Not as souvenirs, but as interpretations. One day, while walking along a dirt road, he saw a man planting seeds. Dinner was simple, normal. But in his mind, he was no longer just a man planting. He was the sower. And then he noticed the first real sign of change. He no longer saw only what was in front of his eyes. He saw it in layers. Later, as he passed by a house where someone was celebrating a meal, he stopped without realizing it. The scene seemed trivial, but now there was another invisible presence there. The banquet. And with it comes the idea of ignored invitations, refused opportunities, silent choices that changed destinies. He felt a slight discomfort, as if each simple situation carried something greater hidden within it. That night, alone, he began to remember everything with greater intensity, not as separate stories, but like fragments of the same thing. Pastor, the sheep, the currency, the sun. The field is divided. The man who entrusted his talents to others. The wounded traveler. The banquet was refused. Everything now seemed connected, as if they were pieces of the same broken mirror. And in that mirror, he began to see himself, not as the central character, but as part of all the stories at the same time. He was the one who was getting lost. What I didn't know. What I expected was a return without effort. What I thought was too early. What he was hiding was what he was afraid of losing. And that wasn't comfortable. It was invasive. Because parables left no room for neutrality. They did not allow for distant observation. They pulled the observer inside. On one of the following days, he heard the man speak again. But this time something was different. Not in the voice. Not in the stories. But in it. He was no longer trying to understand. He just absorbed it. The story of that day was simple. A man made a great discovery in a field. So valuable that he would sell everything to be with her. Then another one found a pearl of extreme value. And he does the same. The desert man did not react.
If you wish to deepen your knowledge of Jesus, the Gospels, and the Christian life, I have prepared a complete guide that can help you on your faith journey. In addition to the main guide, you will receive 3 special bonuses today. The ebook, The Lost Parables, the Gospel Study Journal, and the guide, The Hebrew Mindset. If you found this content helpful, click the first link in the description to learn more. I hope this material helps you further understand Christ's message and strengthen your spiritual journey.
Immediately this time, he simply remained silent. And for the first time, he didn't try to translate the story. He could only feel her weight. Later, he noticed something that frightened him. He could no longer remember exactly where the story ended and his own life began. The lines were fading. He began to observe the people around him. And every behavior now seemed to carry a possible interpretation. A man hurrying past down the street. A woman ignoring someone who was asking for help. A young man hesitating before a choice. Everything seemed to be part of something bigger, but he could no longer explain what. And then came the strangest moment of all. He began to realize that he no longer needed to hear the stories for them to be there. They were already inside him, working, interpreting, reorganizing. It was during this phase that he understood something that left him speechless. Parables were never merely external teachings. They were internal structures in formation. Something that, once heard, could no longer be unheard. One night he sat alone, far from everything. The wind was cold. The sky seemed more open than before. And for the first time he didn't try to understand anything. He simply acknowledged it. He recognized that he was no longer the same man who had arrived in the desert. And that perhaps it never had been. Perhaps he was only discovering this now. The stories were not over. Because they never ended. They kept happening inside him. In silence. Without form. No final explanation. And then he understood something that hadn't come as a thought. It came as a certainty. Parables were not meant to be fully explained. They were meant to be experienced from the inside. And at that moment, he realized there was no turning back. Not because something external held him captive, but because something internal had changed permanently.